bit, check out methane in that video I posted there. It'll be helpful to kind of look at another dynamic besides carbon dioxide. The other thing is what we call feedback mechanisms. There's really three that we care about. Um, the ones we want to look at are the albedo effect. And so the idea is that light surfaces, right, reflect more light, dark surfaces absorb more light. And so if you have more snow and ice, you're going to reflect more light. It's not going to warm up your planet and you'll stay a little cooler, right? If that ice melts, like we know the ice caps are melting right now, you're also going to get more dark surface, right? Which is going to absorb more light, which is going to make you warmer. We call that the albedo effect, right? And you know this to be true for your own personal use, right? If you wear a white t-shirt, that's usually cooler than wearing a black t-shirt, right? Black absorbs more energy, light reflects more energy, okay? Then there's the water feedback loop as well, right? It talks about evaporation. The more water you evaporate, the thicker that blanket gets in the atmosphere, which then causes you to warm more, evaporate more, so on and so forth. And then the methane feedback. And so, we're walking kind of a fine tightrope as a planet. And so it's important that we look at these feedback loops, these feedback mechanisms, because these can have an impact on our planet and our temperature. And so it's important to look at these things. This slide is just about ocean acidification. As you get more carbon dioxide in your atmosphere, that carbon dioxide, some of it will get absorbed by the oceans, that carbon dioxide exchange with the ocean. The ocean will absorb the CO2. That CO2 mixes with water and it makes this new compound called carbonic acid. Okay. And this carbonic acid, it's what is in like a seltzer water, kind of gives it the little bit of a um, kind of a sour flavor potentially, right? If you've ever had seltzer waters or things like that, kind of tastes sour. It's from that carbonic acid. Okay, that's what also gives you the CO2 is what gives you the fizzy bubbles, but that mixes with water and makes carbonic acid. So what happens is, as you get more CO2 in the atmosphere, you get more CO2 being absorbed by the oceans, and that starts to increase. Well, what that then does is makes carbonic acid and it makes the oceans more acidic. And so that, remember, acids are from 0 to 7 on the pH scale. The lower you are, the more acidic you are. So we see our pH of our oceans also going down. So as CO2 increases, your pH decreases and the ocean becomes more acidic. That is a major problem for things like coral that are very sensitive to temperature changes and pH changes, right? You've probably heard of coral reefs dying out right now and coral bleaching. Looking at temperature changes and then acidification are big issues there, okay? Those oceans oftentimes hold that temperature as well. They transport changes in the temperature around the planet through ocean currents. And so that's going to affect global temperature patterns as well and endanger ecosystems, right? Those are going to be some issues eventually, is looking at our ecosystems and how warm and cool water gets transported, normal migration patterns potentially changing, those kinds of things, okay? In general, effects of climate change we look at. Many places are going to get warmer as a result of climate change, some cooler. Why some cooler? Weather's kind of tricky as you change ocean currents. That can also change small regional pockets of weather, right? And then in the US, we're going to see our growing season likely get longer, which means potentially more agriculture. But if our precipitation patterns change, you get warmer, but you don't have as much precipitation, well, that's going to be difficult to grow plants unless you have irrigation, right? And so this could be an issue. In some areas, it might get better. Some areas, it might get worse, okay? Um, Sea levels are going to rise potentially 1 to 4 feet. There's island nations right now that are already, the oceans are kind of creeping up on them. They're worried about not having a country eventually. And then we have coastal cities right now that are starting to flood. Florida's spent billions of dollars already in places like Miami trying to raise the streets and also pump the water back out when the water starts to kind of come up the sewer drains. And so there's already issues in our coastal cities. That's probably going to get worse. And it's many species are going to die off. As you look at, if the Earth changes, if our biomes that these animals are living in change faster than they can adapt, many of them are likely going to die off. Right, natural selection. And then there's going to be trillions of dollars of economic impact as we work through, the coronavirus pandemic. you're seeing the economic issues that that has caused. Climate they think is going to be an issue that's going to cause trillions of dollars in economic impact. And so for you, might you know, that might not be something close to home. I think you're living through that right now of what a major economic crisis looks like. And so they're thinking that, major impacts in the climate could also be, okay? So what do we do? Well, use less, right? I think that's the biggest thing. If we use less, that is going to help mitigate a lot of that. Look at potential renewable sources of energy, things like solar and wind. Eat more sustainably, right? Where do you get your food? How is it packaged? What do you eat? Those kinds of things. Look at some of those things as um, things that you can do. Do your best to recycle and conserve your resources, and then vote for people that share your concerns. Right? If you're worried about those things, find people that are worried about them as well. Okay, and then just keep learning. I think we're learning about climate change constantly, and I think it's worth continuing to make sure that you're on the up and up on that. Okay, your assignment over climate change and our potential impact on that is right here. That here. And so you're going to look at our impact on the environment and then look at some climate information. So you'll click on Launch Interactive once you get here. It's from HHMI again, okay? So you click on Launch Interactive, and if it loads, hopefully it loads here. Give it a second. You're going to see something like this, and you're going to walk through. It's going to give you some information. Make sure that you read this stuff. A lot of the answers to the questions are in this part, okay? And so you can click on things like atmosphere. It's going to give you some data readouts. You'll have to read some little blips about that. If you want to know where they source the information, it's all down here. Make sure you go through this. There's really a lot of really good information. It just kind of tells you what's going on the planet, and you get to read some graphs along the way, which is always a good thing. Okay. So that's really all we have time for with climate change. I'd love to spend more time on that and learn more about it. We just don't have time for it. And so the next thing we want to look at is what's called succession. Okay. Succession is essentially a progression of species, right? As you look at in biological succession or ecological succession. And so I wanted to throw this picture up there. So April 18th last year, we burned a little section of Raider Park to kind of do a little study on succession. Okay. And what we did is we had the fire department come out. They burned a little section of this, and it's black. I mean, you can see it. It killed all the plant life there. It really just torched everything, or so we thought, right? This is what it looked like 3 weeks later. This is that same square 3 weeks later. The grass has already come back. It looks totally different. And in fact, it's healthier than the surrounding area. Look at all the dead grass here. You don't see any of that here. And so we tend to think of things like fire as a bad thing. Not always, right? Fire can be very helpful for an ecosystem. Succession is basically looking at what happens in an ecosystem after there's a disturbance, like fire. Okay? How do ecosystems bounce back? All right. And so this talks about what is succession. It's really the process of life recolonizing after a disturbance. It can be fire, it can be, maybe people driving over that area or hiking over that area, feet trampling on things. Succession comes in lots of forms, but there's essentially two major ones. It's called primary and secondary. So primary succession is when you've stripped everything away. You're down to bare rock, you have no soil, nothing. This takes a long time to go through. Primary succession takes a long time because you essentially have to create all of your soil and then have your plants colonize, and they'll do that in a very specific way. Glaciers can do this, volcanoes can do this. They're a way of going through primary succession. Again, takes a long time. Secondary succession is recolonizing an area that still has soil. So things like fire, maybe tilling up an area, those kinds of things. Okay. How does life bounce back after you've disturbed it? Okay. So this is primary succession. As you look at it, how does life colonize? Well, it starts with lichen. Lichen is this, you've seen this on rocks before. This is lichen. You'll see it out in the Black Hills here. It's a relationship between a fungus and an algae, okay? and they'll work together. And what they do is they will secrete on the rock a very weak acid, and it breaks down the rock, which then gives them the minerals for them to survive. And eventually, it breaks that rock down over years and years and years, and you'll get it into smaller chunks and eventually help make soil, right? And then water and wind erosion as well. But we start with lichen forming on the bare rock surface, right? Breaking it down little by little. Then you get moss growing on that rock. That helps create, eventually, that moss will die and create an organic component to that soil, okay? And so eventually, once you get soil from lichen and moss, you'll kind of get this progression, right? You'll see things like weeds start to grow, grass and flowers, and then eventually shrubs, and then evergreen trees, and then deciduous trees, okay? This is kind of your progression, and you can look at an ecosystem and kind of tell where it's at and how long ago it was reset based on the plants and animals, or I should say by the plants present there, right? If you're looking at an area and you only see grass and flowers, there's a good chance it's early on in succession, right? Either there was a fire, or it got mowed, or it was tilled up, or animals have been grazing on it, whatever it is, okay? There's some verbiage for you. I'll let you look at that. But this next part is secondary succession. This is more common things that we look at. Um, so things like fire, agricultural clearing, sort of like farming and then grazing. Notice we don't have any lichen or moss. After you have something, you get down to bare soil. What's the first thing to grow there? Typically things like weeds or dandelions, things like that. Then you'll get grass and flowers, shrubs, evergreen trees, and then deciduous trees. And so if you look at an area and you see deciduous trees, that tells you that that area hasn't been um, reset or disturbed in a very long time. Okay, if you look at an area and you see only low-lying grasses and some flowers, it tells you that you've been disturbed fairly recently. Okay. Now there's some areas where you'll never get these, right? Either you don't have seeds to grow these trees, or you don't have the water or the right climate. Now that's a factor, but if all those things are available and you don't have this yet, it's because you've been reset somewhat recently. Okay. This just kind of shows you a grazed versus ungrazed land in this reserve in New Zealand. And what do you notice? Well, you notice that animals that have a chance to graze it, that are disrupting it and disturbing it and resetting it constantly, you're less diverse, right? You get a little more monoculture, meaning one type in your grasses or in your plant life, and then you let an area go ungrazed for a while, and you get that progression. You get grasses and then shrubs, and then you'll eventually get trees here, and then you're quite diverse, right? And diversity is a good thing. You don't want to put all your eggs in one ecological basket, so to speak. And so, letting an area go allows it to progress and walk through those steps of succession and eventually recolonize the area in a way that is more diverse. And so sometimes they'll do that. Aquatic succession, I don't want to spend time on this, but essentially aquatic ecosystems can be reset as well. Is succession good or bad? Well, it can be bad if you eliminate rare plants. Let's say there's a fire and it eliminates rare plants or habitat, right? And it makes the soil more susceptible to erosion. But it can be good, right? Resetting an ecosystem might allow new plants to grow, right? It puts nutrients in the soil oftentimes, and it can create more diversity, okay? Our way that we contribute to succession is agriculture and man-made fires, right? Sometimes we do those things, okay? Um, how do we handle succession in the Black Hills? Um, well, we don't really, right? If there's an area, we don't really let it burn. We don't really let the Black Hills burn. Thus, what happens is you get, pine trees becoming very, very dense in their growth, and they all become weak, and you get things like pine beetles wreaking havoc because your forest is overgrown and not super healthy. And so, we try and mitigate it because we have tourism and we like our Black Hills the way they are, but it's pretty normal for forests and things like that to go experience fire and have um, ecological resets essentially. Okay. Um, these are just some of the things that we want to make sure we cover in our ecology unit. We've talked about some of these already. We're going to keep going with that. The second part of your assignment is over uh, succession here. And to get there, you will want to go to this Bioman simulation. Okay, Bioman Succession Interactive, and it kind of walks you through the steps of succession and helps you understand some of those things. Okay, so your goal this week is to look at climate change, human impact, and succession. Human impact is also a section on your final project. Make sure that you look at that and you can start chipping away at that as well. Okay. You'll have a quiz at the end of the week. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, good luck.